You know, every now and then history hands you a story that almost feels too heavy to lift. A story so packed with pain, courage, and raw human stubbornness that even after all these years, it still makes you sit a little straighter and breathe a little slower. And the one we're stepping into today, well, it isn't just a chapter of World War II. It's a wound carved into the memory of an entire city. Picture a place where winter could freeze a man's breath in midair, where a loaf of bread became more precious than gold, where children learned to sleep to the rhythm of artillery. A city trapped for 900 days, 900, almost 3 years of hunger, shelling, and the simple daily battle to stay alive. This wasn't just a siege, it was hell laid out on cold stone streets. And yet, somehow against all logic, the people of Leningrad stayed standing. Before we dive in, let me ask for one small thing. If you love stories like this, if you enjoy these long journeys into the past where we let the memories breathe and the old voices speak again, go ahead and subscribe. Give the video a like too, and share it with someone who gets the same strange comfort from history that you and I do. Every bit of support helps keep these stories alive. Alright, lean in, let's begin. The thing about Leningrad is that it wasn't just another city on a map. It wasn't even just another Soviet city. It was the old imperial heart, cradle of revolutions, home of poets and painters, grand avenues and opera houses. Even the name carried weight. To Hitler, it was more than territory. It was a symbol he wanted erased from the earth. And in the summer of 1941, when the German armies rolled east, he gave an order that still chills the spine. Leningrad was never to be taken, never to be occupied. It was to be surrounded, starved, and wiped clean. People at the time couldn't imagine such a thing. Even after Nazi troops swept through the Baltic states and smashed through defenses north of the city, there was this strange confidence in the air. Leningrad felt enormous, almost eternal. Residents believed the Red Army would hold the line. They trusted the bunkers, the trenches, the ring of forts built decades earlier. They thought they were ready. But war moves fast, faster than most hearts can keep up with, and by early September the German Army Group North had pushed right up to the city's doorstep. To the south, another threat was closing in, Finnish forces advancing to reclaim land lost in the Winter War. Bit by bit, the noose tightened until on September 8, 1941, the last road out of the city fell. Leningrad was cut off from the world. Inside the city, the mood changed in a heartbeat. Tens of thousands of families packed into cramped apartments, sharing ration cards and nervous whispers. There were people who still thought the siege wouldn't last long, maybe a week or two. The government promised swift counterattacks. Newspapers printed brave slogans, but outside, beyond the last streetcar wires, German artillery was already delivering its first barrage. Shells fell on warehouses, fuel depots, rail yards. One lucky hit lit the Badiv food warehouses on fire, taking with them thousands of tons of precious supplies. The flames lasted days. People watched smoke rise into the sky and didn't breathe a word, but they knew exactly what those flames meant. Hunger was coming. And hunger, once it settles in, doesn't leave quietly. At first, rations dropped just a little. A factory worker got 600 grams of bread a day, an office worker 400, children 300, still manageable, people thought. But as the siege ground on and the warehouses emptied, the numbers slid downward. Bread became thinner, darker. It was mixed with sawdust, cellulose, anything the bakers could grind. Some families boiled leather belts to make soup. Others scraped wallpaper paste. Every scrap mattered. A single crust could mean the difference between another day or none at all. Yet life didn't stop. This is the part that always astounds me whenever I read diaries from those months. People kept going to work. Trams, when electricity allowed, still rumbled down the streets. Teachers led classes wrapped in blankets. Musicians rehearsed in unheated halls, not because they were pretending things were normal, but because stopping would have felt like surrender. And Leningraders were a stubborn people, used to cold winters and hard living. They weren't about to hand their city over without a fight. Still, no amount of determination can warm a frozen apartment. The winter of 1941 hit like a hammer. Temperatures plunged to -30 and lower, pipes burst, streetcars froze solid in place. Even the great Neva River turned into a white, silent plain. In those months, cold became a killer just as cruel as hunger. Some families huddled around tiny fires made from chair legs and bookcases. Entire trees in city parks vanished almost overnight, chopped down for fuel. And every morning, the snow hid new bodies lying on the sidewalks. People would walk around them quietly, too weak to stop, too numb to react. Through it all, the bombardment never stopped. German guns hit the city day after day, and the Luftwaffe flew raids whenever the weather cooperated. You'd hear the distant whistle and then a thump that shook window frames. After a while, people learned to judge the distance of a shell by the pitch of its incoming scream. A strange skill to master, but that's what the siege did. It changed people in ways they never could have imagined. When things were at their worst, when the city seemed to be dissolving into frost and silence, something unexpected happened. The frozen Neva became lifeline. Trucks began crawling across the ice, headlights off, loaded with flour, grain, fuel, ammunition. Drivers knew one wrong turn or one unlucky shell could send them plunging into black water, but they went anyway. This makeshift supply line came to be known as the Road of Life. Simple name, but perfectly fitting. It kept the heart of the city beating, just barely. And you know, for as grim as these stories are, there are moments, tiny ones, that shine like sparks. Stories of people sharing their last crumbs with a neighbor. Stories of librarians saving precious manuscripts during air raids. Stories of orchestras performing in freezing halls, fingers stiff, breath misting, while German guns thundered miles away. There's one famous moment when conductor Karl Eliasberg gathered starving musicians and performed Shostakovich's Seventh Symphony right there in the besieged city. They broadcast it through loudspeakers toward the German lines as if saying, "We're still here. You haven't broken us yet." Imagine the courage that took. But those early months were still only the beginning, and no one knew how long the nightmare would stretch. Soviet counterattacks kept failing. German troops dug in deeper. The Finns held firm in the north. Supplies trickled in slowly, never enough. Diaries from the time talk about nights filled with the sound of distant artillery and the creaking of ice on the river. People learned to live with both. Let me pause for just a moment here, because if you're still with me deep inside this story, then I know you care about these forgotten human experiences as much as I do. So if you haven't already, think about subscribing or dropping a like. It keeps these long stories going, and it tells me that you want more of them. All right, let's get back to it. By the beginning of 1942, the city was half ghost, half soldier. Anyone strong enough to work spent long hours in factories that never closed, even when temperatures inside dropped so low the machines themselves froze. Women, teenagers, the elderly, everyone was put to work producing shells, rifles, parts for the front. The Soviets moved entire factories from threatened areas eastward, but Leningrad's factories stayed exactly where they were, pounding out war supplies in the middle of a famine. Workers fainted on assembly lines. They sometimes died right at their posts, and yet production continued. Even so, the winter was brutal beyond words. January saw ration levels hit their lowest point. 125 grams of bread a day for dependents. That's barely enough to keep a person conscious. People wrote in diaries about dizziness, constant shaking, the feeling of sinking into slow motion. They described hunger not as an ache, but as a kind of fog that made thoughts heavy and dreams strange. Families moved slower, spoke slower, everything slower. And through it all, funerals became a sad, everyday routine. Coffins grew scarce, so people wrapped bodies in cloth and placed them on sleds, pulling them through the snow to mass graves. Some couldn't manage even that and had to leave their dead in courtyards until they found the strength. But the remarkable thing is that people didn't give up. They scraped together enough willpower to rebuild shattered buildings, repair tram lines, clear rubble from streets. And all the while, the Red Army outside the city was slowly preparing for a breakthrough. Supplies being hauled over the ice grew in volume. New units were trained, artillery was positioned, plans were drawn. The city didn't know it yet, but the darkest months were starting to loosen their grip, even if only slightly. By spring of 1942, the snow around Leningrad began to melt, though melt might be too gentle a word. It broke apart in gray chunks, revealing months of hidden suffering beneath. Streets that had once been silent with frost now turned into muddy rivers. The smell of thawing earth mixed with smoke and decay. People walked a little faster again, not because they suddenly had strength, but because the cold wasn't holding them hostage anymore. And with the change of seasons came something even more precious. Hope, small and fragile, like the first green stems pushing through frozen soil. Supplies began flowing a bit more steadily. The row of life, now cracking under warmer temperatures, still carried trucks until the ice became too dangerous. Then, as the weather warmed further, barges took over. Not enough food, not enough medicine, not enough fuel, but more than the winter before. And that slight improvement meant people could stand a little straighter, talk a little more clearly, think about something beyond the next hour. The city, though, was scarred in ways words barely catch. If you walked down Nevsky Prospect, the grand avenue that once glowed with nightlife and music, you'd see boarded windows, shattered facades, craters from shells, and the quiet faces of people who had lost almost everything. But every morning, workers still swept the sidewalks, volunteers patched roofs, children carried buckets of water from broken pumps. Life refused to bow its head. At the same time, the Germans tightened their grip on the ring around the city. They built trenches, bunkers, gun nests. They weren't in a hurry anymore. They thought starvation would do the job for them. Hitler had already announced that Leningrad was finished, that it would fall soon enough. But as the months passed and the city still refused to die, frustration grew. The Germans had underestimated something they couldn't measure on any map or timetable: the stubbornness of ordinary people. And those ordinary people kept doing extraordinary things. Engineers repaired power stations under fire. Women climbed to rooftops during air raids to extinguish incendiary bombs with shovels and sand. Firefighters sprinted through streets while shells burst around them. There was a story of a bakery worker who fainted from hunger in front of the ovens but crawled back to his station because he knew the city depended on those loaves. Diaries kept by citizens talk about small victories: getting an extra ladle of soup, hearing a loved one had survived, seeing a tram line restored. Even the sound of distant Soviet artillery firing back brought some comfort. It meant they hadn't been forgotten. But the Germans had a plan for 1942. If the city wouldn't die quietly, they'd crush it with force. The Luftwaffe returned with heavy raids, dropping bombs filled with small metal pellets designed to tear through crowds. German guns pounded neighborhoods day after day, sometimes firing hundreds of shells in a single afternoon. Rooftops collapsed, streets caved in, fires spread. People didn't even flinch anymore when they heard the first whistle of incoming shells. They just moved instinctively toward whatever shelter was closest. Across the river and beyond the German lines, the Soviet High Command was arguing among themselves about how to relieve the city. They knew they needed a breakthrough, but they disagreed on where and how. Some generals pushed for a massive assault. Others warned that rushing would lead only to more deaths. Stalin demanded action, but no one wanted to launch a doomed operation. The first attempt in January 1942, known as the Lubin Offensive, ended in disaster, costing thousands of lives and leaving Leningrad just as isolated as before. Soldiers who survived wrote in their journals about deep snow, frozen weapons, and positions so exposed that even raising a head meant death. Still, the pressure to save the city never eased, and deep inside Leningrad, people continued clinging to the faint promise that someone, somewhere was preparing to break the siege. News trickled in quiet rumors shared in bread lines, hints overheard in factory corridors. People didn't need much, just a sliver of belief that this wasn't forever. Then came the summer, bringing long white nights and mosquitoes thick enough to cloud the air. The city used the warmer months to repair defenses and rebuild morale. Gardens sprouted in courtyards, on rooftops, even in old bomb craters. People planted potatoes, cabbage, anything that might grow. Every leaf mattered. People would kneel in the soil gently, almost tenderly, because they knew those little green plants were lifelines. But even during this brief breath of warmth, the siege remained merciless. Fuel was still scarce. Bread rations only slightly improved. Hospitals overflowed. The Red Army's attempts to break through made progress in some areas but stalled in others. For every meter gained, dozens of men fell. Some soldiers who fought outside the city later wrote that the ground was soaked with so much blood you could see the color even after the rain. And still, Leningrad held. One story I always come back to is about the city's children. Schools tried their best to reopen, even with shattered windows and no heat. Teachers wrote lessons on scraps of paper. Kids learned math while wearing mittens. They were told to hide under desks when shells fell, though everyone knew a desk wouldn't stop anything. But these classes weren't just about education, they were about holding onto a piece of humanity. Parents wanted their children to learn something other. Then fear. By late 1942, the Red Army had grown stronger, better supplied, more confident. Victory at Stalingrad began to shift momentum across the whole Eastern Front, and with that shift came renewed focus on Leningrad. The Soviets launched Operation Iskra in January 1943, a bold plan to punch a narrow corridor through the German lines south of Lake Ladoga. Artillery roared for hours, lighting the sky with orange flashes. The soldiers advanced through snow, mud, smoke, and machine gun fire. German resistance was fierce, but Soviet determination was fiercer. And then finally, after hundreds of days of starvation and loss, the siege cracked just a little. The Soviet forces punched a hole through the German line near Schlüsselburg. It wasn't a complete liberation, far from it, but it opened a land corridor wide enough to build a rail line. Supplies began arriving in far greater quantities: food, fuel, medicine, ammunition. The city could breathe again. Not deeply, not comfortably, but enough to give everyone a sense that the worst might truly be behind them. That tiny breach in the German blockade changed everything. People felt life returning slowly to their limbs. Bread rations increased, work conditions improved. Factories ramped up production with something like real energy again, and you could sense the city's spine straightening after being bent to breaking for so long. Of course, the danger was far from gone. German artillery still rained down on the city and air raids continued, but the fear of absolute starvation finally eased. Let me take a moment here to say something simple. If you've stayed with me through all of this, you're the kind of person who carries history with care. So if you haven't already, think about subscribing or dropping a like or even sharing this with someone who loves these deep dives. It helps keep this old storyteller talking. Now let's keep going. Throughout 1943, Leningrad turned into a city of both ruins and revival. Streets once silent were busy again. Trams rattled along newly repaired tracks. People returned to theaters, museums, libraries, not in crowds, no, but enough to remind themselves of who they were before the siege. Soldiers visited relatives in the city between rotations at the front, their faces carrying that tight, tired look of men who'd seen too much. They told their families that the Soviets were preparing something big, a final push to break the siege entirely. And they were right. Soviet commanders spent months gathering troops, artillery, and supplies. They studied the German positions, mapped enemy trenches, and debated every detail. They were determined that the next offensive wouldn't be another bloody stalemate. Meanwhile, on the German side, morale was slipping. Supply lines were stretched thin. Troops complained about the cold, about Soviet artillery getting stronger, about the sense that they were holding a position that no longer mattered. By the end of 1943, the tides of war were turning everywhere. The Germans had lost ground in the south and the center. The Red Army was marching west. And in January 1944, after 2.5 years of brutal endurance, the Soviets launched the Leningrad-Novgorod offensive. This wasn't just another attempt. This was the moment the city had been waiting for. The artillery barrage that opened the attack shook the ground like a drum. People inside the city felt windows tremble, dust falling from ceilings. They looked at one another with cautious eyes. Could this be it? Could this really be the beginning of the end? That January morning in 1944 felt different from every day that had come before it. People said the air itself felt tighter, as if even the cold was holding its breath. The artillery barrage rolled in waves, booming again and again, shaking cups on kitchen shelves and rattling old window frames. Some residents climbed to rooftops just to watch the flashes on the horizon, their breath turning to mist while the sky flickered like a storm trapped inside the clouds. They didn't celebrate. Not yet. They'd learned that hope was a fragile thing in a city like this. But they listened, and they waited, and they felt something stirring in their chests that hadn't lived there for a long time. On the front lines, Soviet troops pushed hard against German positions that had been fortified for more than 2 years. Snow churned into bloody slush beneath their boots. Machine guns chattered, mortar rounds burst in white sprays, but the Red Army kept moving step by step, village by village, trench by trench. And unlike earlier offensives, this time the Germans were exhausted. Their supply lines were thin, their morale sinking, their commanders arguing over withdrawals and counterattacks. Soldiers wrote home saying they felt like men holding back a river with bare hands. Inside Leningrad, people gathered in apartments, stairwells, cellars, anywhere they could talk and listen together. They traded rumors past knee. Newspapers around tried to read meaning between the lines. Every few hours the radio announced some small advance, some captured hill or shattered bunker. Children were the boldest. They whispered to one another that the siege was almost over, that the bad days were finally ending. Their parents hushed them gently, but even they couldn't hide the glimmer in their eyes. The breakthrough, when it finally came, arrived almost quietly. Soviet forces smashed through the last major German defensive lines to the south and west, forcing a rapid retreat. Entire German artillery batteries that had shelled Leningrad for years were overrun in a matter of hours. Troops poured into villages whose residents had lived under occupation since the earliest days of the war, bringing food, blankets, cigarettes, simple kindness. And then, on January 27, 1944, the Red Army declared that the Siege of Leningrad had been fully lifted. When the news reached the city, something inside the people cracked open. They poured into the streets. They hugged strangers. They cried openly, grown men and women who hadn't wept in years. The city set off fireworks made from salvaged explosives, lighting up the sky that had so often glowed only from fires and bomb blasts. For once, the flashes were not a warning, they were a release. But the victory didn't erase the cost, not even close. Almost 1 million civilians had died, mostly from hunger, cold, and disease. Entire families vanished. Entire neighborhoods were transformed into empty rows of windows. Survivors carried memories so sharp and heavy that some never spoke of them again. And yet the people who lived through it didn't see themselves as heroes. They saw themselves as people who simply did what they had to do, who endured because giving up wasn't an option. After the siege was lifted, the city faced the long task of healing. Clearing rubble, repairing water lines, restoring heat, patching roads, everything needed work, and the people set to it with the same quiet determination that had carried them through the darkness. Musicians returned to concert halls, theaters reopened, schools welcomed children again, factories roared back to life. And slowly, almost shyly, Leningrad began to breathe like a living city once more. What always moves me most when reading the diaries and letters from those years is how the small things mattered just as much as the big ones. A warm cup of milk after months of watery soup, a candle that didn't blow out, a letter arriving from a son at the front, a stranger sharing a biscuit. These moments didn't make the siege shorter or the German guns quieter, but they reminded people that the world still held a little kindness. And that was sometimes all they needed. As the war moved on and Soviet armies pushed deep into German territory, Leningrad became a symbol of survival. Soldiers heading west would stop in the city to rest briefly, and they would meet residents who looked thin, tired, older than their years, but still standing. These soldiers saw in their faces a strength that inspired them through some of the hardest battles of the final years of the war. There's an old man I once read about who lived on Vasilievsky Island. After the siege, he kept a small wooden box under his bed. Inside the box were the tiny ration cards he'd saved from 1941 and 1942, each one stamped and worn. When asked why he kept them, he said they weren't reminders of misery. They were reminders of what he'd survived. They were proof that even when the world around him froze and starved and burned, he didn't give in. That little box was his medal. Let me pause for just a moment, because if you've come this far with me, you're part of the reason these stories stay alive. So if you haven't yet, think about subscribing, liking, or sharing this with someone who loves history told with a little heart. It helps more than you might think. Now let's keep going to the end. In the years after the war, the people of Leningrad rebuilt their homes, their theaters, their museums. They restored bridges and parks. They replanted the trees that had been chopped down for firewood. Children born after the war grew up hearing the stories, sometimes whispered, sometimes spoken with pride, about the cold nights, the hunger, the bombings, and the courage that held the city together. And as time went on, those who had lived through the siege grew older. Their voices softened. Their memories grew a little blurred around the edges, but the emotion never left them. There's something about the Siege of Leningrad that lingers long after you set the history books down. It isn't just the numbers, though the numbers alone are staggering. It isn't even the length of the ordeal, though 900 days feels almost impossible to grasp. What stays with you is the simple, unbreakable human will. The way ordinary people, bakers, teachers, workers, children, faced a storm that should have swallowed them whole, and some held on. The way a city with no food, no heat, no escape still found room for kindness, for art, for laughter, for music. The way they kept their dignity when everything around them tried to crush it. And if you listen closely to the stories from those years, you hear something else, something quiet but steady. It's the sound of humans refusing to disappear. A city refusing to let winter or hunger or war define its final breath. A reminder that sometimes the strongest battles are fought not with guns but with endurance. That survival in its own way can be a form of victory. As the siege ended, the war ended, the ruins were rebuilt. But what happened in Leningrad left a mark on the world, a reminder of what people can face and still rise from. In every cracked photograph, in every faded diary page, in every old man's trembling voice telling his grandchildren about the winter of 41, you feel that echo. And even now, decades later, when you walk the streets of the city, now called St. Petersburg, you'll find small plaques on buildings marking where bombs fell, where shells struck, where lives were changed forever. They're quiet markers. They don't shout, they whisper, they remind. And maybe that's how stories like this should end. Not with grand statements or triumphant music, but with a quiet breath, a moment of stillness. Because the people who lived through those 900 days didn't think of themselves as heroes. They were simply people trying to survive another day, and that, in the end, is what makes their story so powerful. Not the size of the tragedy, but the strength of the human spirit that carried them through it. That spirit, steady, stubborn, unbroken, is what keeps their memory alive. And as long as we tell their story in voices like mine and ears like yours, they never really fade.